Welcome everyone. My name is Dionyssis Dimitrakopoulos, and as regular viewers will know, I'm the curator of this vlog series, which is called Talking Europe, that is ably edited by my colleague Rebecca Bonaparte. In today's episode, I have asked one of our doctoral students in the Department of Politics, Matt Bevington, to summarize the state of play, what we know at the moment about the impact of a no-deal Brexit. We are recording this on the 15th of December, which is when the media tell us there is a growing likelihood of a deal between the two sides. But since there is no guarantee, I thought it would be useful to ask Matt, who has been following these negotiations very, very closely, to summarize what we know about the implications of a no-deal Brexit. Matt has been following this saga, the negotiations regarding Brexit, from the beginning in his capacity as a researcher for the UK in a changing EU think tank, which is funded by the ESRC. Without further ado, I will ask my only introductory question, which is, in case of a no-deal Brexit, what can we expect?
Well, we can expect different impacts in different areas, I think. To start with the economy, which is the thing that most people care about most, the impacts, I think, are quite stark. And just recently we had a report from the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the government's fiscal watchdog, setting out its economic forecast, both in light of COVID, but also it set out some forecasts about what a no deal might mean. The important thing about that forecast was, firstly, that its baseline scenario with a deal would take around 4% off the UK economy compared to EU membership. So that's already baked into what they have calculated. No deal, they estimate, would add a further 2% on that. So the overall impact of leaving the EU without a deal will be around 6% on the economy over the long term, i.e. it will be 6% smaller. To compare that to COVID, just briefly for comparison, they estimate that the long-term impact of COVID on the economy will be something like 3%, so about half. So obviously, COVID has had much more of a tangible effect on people's lives over recent months. And the impact of Brexit economically have so far been quite abstract, always in the future, that's about to change on the 1st of January. But it's important to note that in the long term, Brexit and no deal in particular would be much more damaging to the UK economy than even COVID would be, despite how dramatic things have been so far.
The institution for which you work, which is, as I said at the beginning, the UK in a changing EU think tank, has produced a series of reports on no deal. One came out in 2017, another one in 2019, and there's a most recent one that came out a few weeks ago. Would you like to tell us what the latest one indicates as to the costs of a no-deal Brexit?
Well, to be honest, all of those reports were quite similar in content, but we've just updated them over time. I guess the overall message is that there are a lot of uncertainties from Brexit in trying to untangle the UK and EU. Those things are exacerbated with no deal because you have much harder barriers going up between the two sides, most notably in the form of tariffs. Now, tariffs are important, but generally they're quite low these days. And the most important thing is actually not what people call non-tariff barriers, so regulatory differences, competition differences, differences in domestic policy that actually affect trade across borders. Those are the most important impacts. And those will exist anyway, even if there's a deal between the UK and the EU, but they'll be worse if there's no deal. There are other important impacts as well. I mean, across all sorts of sectors. One of the interesting things these days is that we're seeing with the pandemic that certain sectors such as hospitality, events businesses and things like that are being very badly affected because they can't really adapt to social distancing. What you would see in the event of no deal is that very different kinds of sectors are affected, so such as financial services, business services, manufacturing, sectors that can reasonably well adapt to COVID conditions and social distancing. Will find it much more difficult to adapt if there are large trade barriers in the way, especially in the manufacturing sector. I mean, some of these supply chains are very, very efficient and working very tight schedules. if there are any sorts of delays at the border, these things are going to be disrupted. It's kind of inevitable, and I think the government expects there to be delays come the 1st of January, whatever happens. And again, if it's no deal, those things will be even worse. And then there are also really important impacts in some sort of not non-economic, but less directly macroeconomic areas. I mean, Northern Ireland is a really important one of these. Over the last few months, the government has been negotiating with the EU about how the east-west border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is going to work in future. Lots of those issues have now been resolved, at least for now. But the impact of no deal would basically mean hardening that border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It would mean more checks were needed when goods are passing from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. It would mean tariffs on goods that were considered at risk, in inverted commas, of entering Ireland and therefore the EU from Northern Ireland as well. And then that has the potential then to have secondary impacts on the politics, because if we end up with no deal, the government in the past has indicated that it might not implement some of those checks. It might not charge those tariffs that it's meant to do based on the withdrawal agreement. And the knock-on impact on that is then to put Ireland in a very difficult position whereby its border then becomes a porous border within the EU and the integrity of the single market is then jeopardized. And they would basically have to make a choice about whether they wanted to institute a hard border on the island of Ireland, which of course this whole negotiation has been about avoiding, or whether they were willing to have barriers between the island of Ireland and the rest of the EU market, which obviously they wouldn't want to do. So I think the implications in Northern Ireland are extremely complicated and could very quickly unwind into something quite nasty and clearly undesirable. In other areas as well that people don't really talk about very much is security, especially police and judicial cooperation. It's kind of not very, I don't know, not very sexy, not very interesting compared to economics, which is very easy to quantify in numbers. But things like the exchange of passenger records on flights between the UK and the EU, vehicle registration numbers, DNA figures, criminal records, all these things that the police forces on both sides have been using for many years and have got used to using in terms of fighting crime will no longer be there for UK authorities, and UK data will no longer be there for EU authorities as well. So it'll make it much more difficult to track criminals and to keep people safe on both sides. Beyond that, I mean, I think there are really important political implications in the UK as well. The most obvious one of those, I mean, seems to be Scotland. I am sure in number 10 they are thinking about the impact on Scotland, and that is playing into their decision making. But it seems that if there is no deal, it will be such a gift to the SNP come the May elections. I mean, not only will they be able to say that the British government has ignored Scottish interests by leaving the EU, by leaving the customs union, by leaving the single market, all things that the Scottish government didn't want to do and Scottish voters didn't want to do, but then they couldn't even strike a basic trade deal with the EU as well. I think it will be a gift to them. It will ramp up the pressure for a second independence referendum, and the Prime Minister might think that he's the one who has the power to grant that referendum, so he can just keep denying it. But I think in reality, the political pressure that will arise if there is a big SNP win will be very difficult to resist, especially come the next election in the UK. And also that then has knock-on effects in Northern Ireland as well. I mean, it's less I suppose imminent a referendum in Northern Ireland, but it's certainly something that's being talked about, certainly something that's being worked out, and certainly something that Sinn Féin are increasingly bullish about. So I think, again, that's something that could very easily unwind and have long-term knock-on impacts that perhaps aren't so obvious now. On the sorry, you can say.
If I could interject, in the context of all of this in relation to Northern Ireland should be placed in the context of a new US administration that takes a fundamentally different stance on this issue and the issue of trade relations with the UK than the outgoing one.
Yeah, and I mean, some people seem to think that that's why the UK government has made movements in recent weeks on the joint committee with the EU, which is the UK EU body that's managing the withdrawal agreement. Some people think that the fact that Joe Biden won and the things that he said, he's obviously very proud of his Irish roots, that's driven the UK to be more conciliatory when it comes to Northern Ireland to try and resolve those issues. But I think there are clearly big risks there. I remember seeing it at an event a couple of years ago, one of our events. Prominent unionist politician from Northern Ireland saying, you know, if Brexit means the breakup of the union, it wasn't worth it. And I think certainly for some unionist politicians in Northern Ireland, they're really starting to rue not really having thought this through in great depth, or at least not having thought their strategy through in great depth. And I think it probably has unpicked some threads that really will be very difficult to tie back together. There's a long way to go. I mean, I think it's equally complicated for Ireland if there is a unification referendum. Very, very complex set of issues for the Irish government to deal with, not just the British government. So I don't think it's. I think that's why you see from the Irish government quite a moderate tone when it comes to unity referendum. I mean, I think if you asked most Irish people, do they think Northern Ireland should be part of Ireland? The answer would be yes. But when you get to the practicalities of how you actually carry that out, it becomes very, very complicated and very difficult. So I think there's a long way to go in Northern Ireland. I don't think we're yet in the sphere of a unity referendum. But what I'm saying is, no deal certainly, I think, puts a booster under Scottish independence referendum chances, and I think that has the potential to have spillover effects in other parts of the union as well.
Okay, on this rather pessimistic but quite realistic tone, perhaps we should finish this episode. But it's important to note, and I presume you will agree if I say that a no-deal Brexit is not going to be the final outcome, in the sense that it will, if it happens, it will happen for a certain period of time, but there will be a time when the two sides will go back to the negotiating table to find an ultimate solution. It's not meant to be. I don't know of any serious scholar or commentator who basically argues that a no-deal Brexit will be the final outcome, period.
No, I think the two sides are driven together by geography, by economic ties. It's inevitable there will have to be some sort of agreement at some point. I think where it's less clear, on the EU side, there seems to be a feeling that within a month or two of no deal, the UK will be back at the table negotiating and be in a much weaker position, and it will be easier for the UK to find the compromises it needs to reach a deal. I'm a bit more sceptical about that, and I actually think the longer the UK waits after no deal, in a way, the stronger its position becomes, because all of the economic impacts are then baked in. All of the disruption has already happened, and an agreement thereafter doesn't necessarily prevent any of that disruption. It's more like a normal trade negotiation where you're bringing down barriers rather than trying to decide how many barriers you're going to put up. So it's a very different kind of negotiation, I think, in that scenario. But yes.
It will be different, but one caveat which I would add, although you don't have to agree with me, is that disinvestment is not an event. It's a process. So if we get to a no-deal Brexit, the withdrawal of foreign direct investment from the UK will not happen overnight. It will happen over a period of time. For example, manufacturers of cars will not simply stop producing cars in the UK. They will start producing new models first, and then at some point in time, they will withdraw. If there is no acceptable deal to them, they will withdraw completely. So there are some of the implications of no-deal Brexit that will materialize over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true, and I think some of that is already happening. I guess the only question I would have is, has any of this really been driven by economics since the beginning? I mean, if it were, this wouldn't really be the deal that the UK government would be negotiating. I think they'd be at least trying to stay in the customs union and single. If the economics was the primary driver for them, it's clearly not, and they've made a legitimate choice that they've got other priorities that they want to pursue. But I think to imagine that in the few months after no deal, the two sides very quickly go back to the table to negotiate is quite difficult to imagine. I mean, we've already seen hints of it in the last week or so with threats of gunboats in the Channel and stuff, and you've seen French politicians threatening to withdraw or arguing that the French government should withdraw cooperation on migration across the Channel. You could easily see how tit for tat gradually just escalated to the point where the political will to negotiate an agreement was very, very low indeed. And just probably to say finally, I think any trade agreement between the two sides will be economically damaging, as I said at the beginning. It will be thin. It won't be anything like the kind of economic relationship we've had before. But one of the main benefits of an agreement is that it means there is a framework to build on in future, and it means we avoid the rancor and the political conflict that would inevitably come with no deal. So I think it's important to remember the things that we will have avoided if there's a deal, not just the direct negative impacts.
One final point, if I may interject, is that the no deal scenario is only one form of a hard Brexit. The presence of a deal does not necessarily mean, and I presume you will agree, that we will not have a hard Brexit. As I said, hard Brexit takes various forms. One of them is a no deal Brexit. And this is what we have been discussing today on the basis of your expertise. Thanks very much indeed for joining us again, and I hope if there is an agreement between the two sides, you will come back to explain the main points.
Absolutely.
Thank you.